I am Rebecca from ChemKnits, and welcome to the 2021 ChemKnits Hanukkah special. Every night during Hanukkah and a few beyond, there will be a new yarn dyeing video as a gift from me to all of you, and I'm really excited to kick off this year's special. Earlier this year, I mixed all 40 Jacquard acid dyes together, and it created this beautiful neutral purple taupe type color. And because this custom mixture has all of the different pigments that Jacquard uses in that line, when you speckle with it, it breaks and you see so many different colors on the yarn, and it's absolutely amazing. But I have not yet tried to mix this powder with citric acid and speckle that way, and this is something that's been on my list for a while, and so I thought it would be really fun to start off Hanukkah with a throwback to that epic mixing live stream and to try 4 different ways of speckling with this custom pre-mixed color that I created. Before we jump into the yarn dyeing, I want to remind you that the ChemKnits Creations Black Friday specials are still ongoing. You can find links down in the video description, and I'll chat a little bit more about it at the end of the video. But now, let's go dye some yarn! Here is the Muk acid dye in this lovely reused container. I started with 20 grams of the dye because I used half a gram of each of the 40 Jacquard acid dyes. And I have a fair amount of it left that we will be using today. I am now wearing my respirator mask, safety glasses, and gloves. And in this container here, I've added 2 tablespoons of citric acid powder. And I am going to come in with, and we'll see how much of this powder we feel like we have. Okay, I'm going to use approximately, I think, half of a teaspoon of our Muk acid dye to dilute it nicely, and so we can have a fairly consistent proportion of our dye. And now I'm going to stir this up. I think that the container that I have this Muk mixture stored in is great for storage. It might be a little hard for me to reach my fingers in, so I may end up taking some of that powder into like a smaller cup so I have an easier time with the speckling. But now what I'm doing is mixing up, and I'm trying, these clumps are the citric acid. I'm trying to distribute the dye through the powder as evenly as I possibly can. Now I'm really curious whether this will mean we see fewer multicolored speckles than what we see with powder that has not been mixed with citric acid. But I will leave this covered when I'm not using it. I don't know exactly how many different pigments there are in all 40 Jacquard acid dye colors, but it's not 40. A lot of those colors are pre-mixed blends of other primaries that are in the collection. But because we do have multiple different pigments in here mixed together, that's why we end up with multicolored speckles, and we see that breaking all those different hues with the speckling itself. Now, the reason why I think we might see more or maybe fewer colors when we have the color mixed with citric acid powder is that when you're mixing the dyes with the citric acid powder, the dye kind of sticks to the outside of the citric acid crystals, which I think gives us still some breaking, but we might see a little bit more of an average, if that makes sense. Because with the citric acid, each citric acid crystal is bigger than each of the particles in the non-citric acid mixture, which makes speckling easier, but also it could combine a few of those multicolored pigments into one speck. So we will see as we proceed with our project. I pre-soaked the yarn, which is Wool to Die For's Platinum Sock and DK. All of the yarn is 75% superwash merino, 25% nylon, but some of it is fingering weight and some of it is DK weight. I pre-soaked it for about 24 hours in this 5-gallon bucket, and I'm now going to add about one of these cups full of white vinegar to this bucket. And we will reuse this water for our immersion speckles. but it also is so that way we have some acid on our yarn ready to go for our countertop speckles. And I am gonna just let this soak in our now acidic water until we're ready to get going. Currently on the counter, I have 400 grams of yarn, a fingering and DK to use without citric acid, and a set of fingering and DK to use with the citric acid. There is a chance that some dye may go onto the wrong quote set, but I did want to do this side by side on the countertop at the same time so I could make real-time pre-heat setting observations where I knew I was treating things fairly consistently. I also have some yarn mops off to the side. This is a skein of Knit Picks Swish DK and Knit Picks Stroll that I pre-soaked in that same pre-soak bath off camera just for a couple of minutes. I will use these to wipe excess dye off of my gloves, to clean up any dye on the countertop and things like that. If you'd like to learn more about any of the tools, equipment, etc. yarn that I'm using in this video, I do have links and affiliate links down in the video description. I'm all masked up again. One of the most important things when it comes to speckling is making sure that your gloves or whatever you're using for it are dry. That's a lot of powder. If your gloves are damp, then the dye will stick more to them, then you will be able to apply it to the yarn. And what I'm doing is taking a pinch of the dye and slowly letting the powder fall from my fingertips onto the yarn. And since we're dealing with a total, I think, in each of these little bundles of 20 10-gram mini skeins, I do want to make sure I get decent coverage because we don't want there to be any minis with no dye in there. And if I am careful with this powder, then I can add it back to our stock container. But now I have dye on my fingers. I am going to wipe it onto our yarn mop. And even in this, I see some like warm tones and cool tones on here from just doing that. But after wiping the dye off, I will dry my fingers before we do our first pass into our citric acid mixture, which I am very excited about. Now the thing with mixing dyes with citric acid is that you can be heavier with your sprinkling. Think about sprinkling like salt or something onto it. You can be a little bit heavier just because the dye, each pinch of dye doesn't have as much pigment as a pinch of the straight dye powder. So I am going a little heavier here, but my goal is still to spread it out versus letting it clump and applying it in large batches. I mean, I think that's pretty good for a first pass. Okay, and I think some pigments definitely stick on the gloves. The first wipe of my fingers from the with no citric acid felt cooler toned, like more black. Maybe I see a little bit more warm tones from the next one. I don't know. Ooh, so I already see red and blue and maybe some like blackish speckles over here. And the same, I'm seeing the same over here, but they're more spread out. Oh, that's so pretty. So pretty. Okay, I'm gonna let this sit for a couple of minutes and then I'm gonna zoom in closer so that way you guys can see. With just the dry powder, I see a variety of colors in here already. There are, and some of this might be off camera, I see a tiny amount of orange and yellow, maybe a little bit of green, but I mostly see pink and red, which do feel different, and blue, and then some of these more combination areas that are an undetermined deep color. It's very beautiful. But what I want you to notice is see how big each individual speckle is here. Compared to our citric acid speckles, where we got a lot more coverage through here, but things are more spread out because it's mixed with citric acid. And I don't know all the colors we can see in this area right now, but looking, I absolutely see yellow speckles, I see an orange, red, pink, blue, and then some deeper colors. So I think I am seeing just as many multicolored speckles. So my hypothesis may have been wrong, but we will absolutely take a closer look at things after we've heat set the yarn and the yarn dries. I flipped the yarn over, taking care to not try to rub it on the counter, but really sort of lift and place to start dyeing the other side. And then I would sort of flip inside out and add more dye as needed to various areas of yarn, taking care to make sure that my gloves didn't have dye on them anytime I was lifting the yarn. So I would wipe my hands on the yarn mop before manipulating the yarn in any kind of way to try to avoid adding thumbprint sized splotches onto the yarn. This time I didn't really wait in between any of the flips. I knew that dye would continue to soak in as things were moved around, but I did just want to try to get reasonable coverage so that way we would have some speckles on every single individual mini skein. I am really satisfied with the color coverage that we have here. So I'm now going to carefully lift up our yarn and go place it in the steamer basket. And both versions will be in the steamer basket next to each other. I don't think that that'll make a huge difference because we do see very multicolored specks on both. And now for our counter, I'm gonna come in with these yarn mops and wipe up all of this powder that has fallen onto our counter over the course of our yarn dyeing. I do think, and I always do this, I do think I overestimated the amount of citric acid powdered speckles I was gonna need today. I always do this. Normally I do 1 tablespoon, and today I was like, well, I should do 2. And granted, we are gonna be dyeing more yarn with it. It's not gonna go to waste. And at the very least, if I want more coverage on these mops, I can always use some more of those speckles on here. But I will go ahead and now wipe down the counter with a paper towel now that I've wiped all this up. But just a way to leave no dye behind. I am going to steam set the yarn in the steamer basket for at least 30 minutes. And then I will remove the yarn to let it cool completely. Okay, the 30 minutes are up, and so I am now going to carefully remove our yarn and set it aside to cool. And I am going to go ahead while we're at it and pop these yarn mops in just for a couple of minutes, so that way the color already on there can set. That just gives me more surface area to work with. There's not a lot of dye on here yet, but since I have a waiting period anyway, I may as well just pop this in for a couple of minutes. I will heat set it properly for a full 30 minutes at the end of the video off camera. But just look at how many different colors we see, from that bright green to more an orangey red, pink, blue. There are so many different colors in here. I don't know how many colors we see yet with the citric acid, so we'll have to look and see if we see quite as many as we do with the straight powder. But both of these are super multicolored and gorgeous. Meanwhile, let's start with one of our immersion colorways. I have 300 grams of yarn, fingering weight and DK, with 6 cups of that pre-soak water that had vinegar in it already. And now I'm going to turn on the 2 burners here and here and heat things up so we can start speckling. I am all messed up again, and I just reduced the heat to low so we can come in and start speckling. Now it is extremely important to try to keep your fingers dry once again, but a main difference between now and the last time we were speckling on the counter is that the steam will make your fingers wet, so you may need to stop and dry them. And I'm doing the dry powder with no citric acid, trying to, as I go across, get a little bit of dye across all of the strands. The mini skeins, these micro skeins from Wool to Dye For, are a little bit shorter than a full skein, so things aren't quite as scrunched as it would be if it was a full skein. But I will need to flip things multiple times because I want to make sure that each of the minis
does have good amounts of dye on it, whereas if it was a fuller skein, then I could be okay with a little bit lighter coverage. I just wiped my hands off in the yarn mop, and I see blue and some red spreading out already. The big difference with doing immersion versus countertop dyeing is some pigments will strike and sort of set right where you put them. Others are going to spread and move more. So I do want to wait, I think 5 to 10 minutes before I flip the yarn and add more dye to the other side. So that way we allow these colors to strike where they are as much as possible. So I'll be back, I think, in 10 minutes. We probably didn't need to wait a full, ooh, I see a green speck there. We probably didn't need to wait a full 10 minutes, but I did just want to give it time so things were set, because otherwise when we flipped it, as soon as it comes into contact with water, then that would cause some more spread. Clearly we have spread around these speckles. It's just a very different kind of look. But technically, even though what we've got is a mega premixed mixture, we're just dealing with one color, really. And seeing how we can get 4 subtle but different effects just based on how we are applying the dry powder to the yarn, which is really, really fun. Sometimes I get questions about why I speckle with my fingers instead of speckling, say, for example, with like a salt shaker or something. And that is really just personal preference. I like the tactile control I get. I found that when I tried using a salt shaker, I would end up adding large clumps of dye in areas, not necessarily getting a more even distribution that I wanted. But you can go for smaller specks with the powder. But anyway, I am, well, gonna go wipe my fingers on my yarn mops. And now I'm gonna wait before I flip this again.
It's probable that 5 minutes, or really even like a little bit less than that, would be enough time. But 10 minutes is absolutely plenty to make sure that if there's a larger clump of dye, it's had a chance to get wet and then sink into the fiber. So waiting longer certainly doesn't hurt at all. But oh, I forgot how much I love this custom Muk mixture. Oh, and if you're curious why it's called Muk, we named it after the Pokemon. Once I was happy with the level of Speckles, I added more of that pre-soak water that had just water with vinegar in it, and then let the yarn simmer for 20 minutes, and then I turned off the heat and let things cool off completely. I reset a new dye bath with 6 cups of that pre-soak water and 300 grams of yarn, so that way we can do the same kind of immersion speckle colorway, but this time using our dye that had been mixed with citric acid.
Okay, my mask is on. I'm gonna reduce the heat to low. Now coming in with a pretty large pinch of our dye mixed with citric acid, I am doing sort of an original sprinkling of it. I wonder, ooh, I see some blue spread. I was just gonna say, I wonder if we'll see a little bit less spread or different spread, because we are adding like probably somewhat smaller clumps of dye, but we will see. Very, very curious. Ooh, I see yellow, red, pink, the blue. So the citric acid did not diminish those other colors very much. There was a Chanukah once where, or maybe it was a summer mini skein mini series, where I tried making my own like custom powder mixtures. And I did find that the colors sort of averaged a little bit, so it may depend on the different pigments a little bit. I am going a little heavy, but the one thing I am trying to do is I'm trying to make sure every strand has at least a little bit of color. Because again, we're dyeing packs of mini skeins here, 10 gram minis. And so we don't want there to be one with like next to no color. But I'm still going for something more subtle. Ooh, orange, subtle overall. So I am going to let this sit for 10 minutes, but I guess I'm adding a little more.
I don't remember if I zoomed in or not on the last one, but we've got some like reds in there, a blue, and I'm seeing in this little area a lot of yellow that is spreading as well. Up here, oh, that's off camera where I have the little bit of orange, but we see little like pops of color that are, and there's a little bit of orange, they're spreading out. I see some more purple over there. This is so pretty and fun because we do have a bunch of dark speckles that are sort of the average of a lot of these pigments. But then we have these little confetti like pops of color randomly distributed, which is so much fun. And we're seeing more of these little spreads here when we're immersion dyeing than we did on the countertop, because once you apply the dye onto yarn on the counter, there's not really space for things to spread out. If there's not a lot of liquid, things will sort of strike and get wet and then sort of stay where you put it. But with more liquid, there's a chance if they're not striking that fast for the colors to sort of diffuse a little bit and give us these little streaks of color. After the 10 minutes, I flipped and added more color to the other side, waiting 10 minutes and flipping, just like I did when we didn't have citric acid mixed in with the powder. Now, there's a chance that the citric acid powder is helping things strike faster because that's adding more acid in there. But in each time I pinch and add a few particles, there is just less dye that is going onto the yarn, and so that also helps things strike a little bit faster because less dye, if it's doing it at the same rate, then that's just going to be faster. So I probably was adding dye a little bit heavier overall here, but I have no idea in terms of the absolute amount of dye how this immersion pan compared with the other one. Here I have the cooling dye bath from the last of our minis, and I'm coming with our 2 yarn mops. There is a little bit of some unset color in here, and they are really subtle and pretty and have a lot of different tones from the Speckles. But since I have so much of those citric acid speckles left over,
we aren't going to use all of it, nowhere close, but I was curious how much things might sink down and strike if I were to come and speckle with it using this higher immersion. Okay, well, some of this was lightly speckled, some less light, because it looks like the citric acid powder is falling onto the yarn. So it's not dissolving right away. And then rather than spread, we're still seeing some speckles, which is super cool and not something I was super aware of. So that is mega cool. Mega cool. I'm not going to do a ton of this on here, but I did want to add like a little bit of more speckles on here just for fun. And I was curious what would happen if I'd see like the colors bloom, but they are sinking almost like mini inkers. I don't think I'd be able to zoom in enough to give a mega good glimpse of that. And so yeah, I just think that this is an all-over random colorway, but I thought that a little bit of some speckles on it would be nice and fun. And I have no idea. I'll certainly save this. I don't know what I'm going to do with it. Something someday for sure. Like, I love this custom muck color. Let's see. I might be pretty much done, but maybe we'll just flip one more time, see if there's anywhere where I wish I had, I'll do one more pass. Why not? This color for this kind of yarn mop is so random that it doesn't need any more, but I have so much of this powder, and this is just such a fun thing to play with. And not to mention that this is inspiring me for other things. Like, maybe it's because the water had cooled down a little bit, but I'm just in awe. Because normally when powder hits the water first, it doesn't flow all the way down. So that's just wild to me. But anyway, I'm gonna heat this for 20 minutes and then wash it off camera.
Let's wash our countertop yarn. I will probably go ahead and wash all of the rest of the yarn that I dyed in this video off camera. I did do some more citric acid countertop speckles to finish up all the yarn I need for these Chanukah sets. Ooh, but look at all these colors. Okay, the sun's in the way, but you can still see there's lots of colors. Lots of colors. I'm not expecting there to be any bleeding. Certainly we have in this mix pigments that do bleed. However, given that this dye, this custom premix dye, is only 1/40th of all these other colors, something like hot fuchsia, which is a notorious bleeder, isn't going to have a huge impact on this. It depends on how many like colors that pigment is mixed in as well, but it shouldn't have massive impact. And so I am not seeing any color bleeding, which is fantastic. So I'm going to go ahead and rinse out the rest of the soap here, put my yarn through the spin dryer, and then hang it up to dry. So then we can come back and look at all of this beautiful yarn up close. But I mean, this is so cool! And as I mentioned, I'm gonna go ahead and wash all the rest of the yarn, including the yarn mops, off camera because I'm not anticipating any of the others. Since it's a similar amount of dye on everything, I'm not anticipating anything bleeding. Here are the 4 types of speckled colorway that we created with this custom blend I made of all 40 Jacquard acid dyes. For speckles, we did some citric acid speckles and then some non-citric acid speckles. And the results are pretty clear. When we mix the dye with citric acid, we get these super microfine speckles. They are small, they are compact, and they are in so many different colors because we have a mixture that contains all of the different pigments that are available in the Jacquard line. Just using the straight powder, we still have some sharp and fine speckles, but they are not quite as sharp as with that citric acid. And we still see a lot more of the different colors. I have no idea if I used a lot more pigment total when I was using the dye powder directly versus the citric acid mixture. But both are really, really cool. Focusing on just the DK, the impact of the speckles using just the dry powder is way more apparent from back here. The speckles are much, much more subtle when we have the citric acid mixture. And it almost looks like a tonal until you zoom in and see just how many colors are there. Now, if we compare the yarn speckled with dry powder on the countertop versus the yarn speckled with dry powder with low immersion, I don't know how much this is showing up on camera, but this yarn has almost a pink, beige-ish type base. There was some amount of pigment spread here that we didn't have from the countertop because since it wasn't immersed in water, there wasn't an opportunity for things to spread. Still, on this low immersion yarn, you can see so many different colors. I mean, we've got like green and orange, red, pink, blue, teal, so many different colors. And I think in some areas, the tiny speckles are a little bit finer than they were. Maybe not when we did the dry powder on the countertop. There's still some that are pretty fine. But the main difference is that occasionally, in addition to the overall halo, there are some spots where you see, rather than a speckle, the colors have really spread a bit more. A big difference between using just the dry powder low immersion and using the powder mixed with citric acid low immersion is that here I'm not feeling that pink base as much. And I also think I ultimately layered on a lot more dye because I was able to get it to spread out pretty far. There are multiple regions in here where a color struck and spread a fair amount. I think that there's like a blue section over here, but a lot of the speckles are still super, super sharp and fine. And I definitely observed while speckling that when I speckled onto the yarn, the speckled powder would just sink onto the yarn versus dissolving when it hit the surface like dry powder might. And so that was really, really cool and interesting and something I really need to play with more. But look at this section of fingering weight low immersion speckles and just see how many colors there are. Oh, it is so much fun. I would say the difference between our low immersion and Countertop citric acid speckles, the biggest difference are these larger patches where there is some color spread that we see here. Like there's an orange one. There are some pigments and a little bit of pink. There are some pigments that are slower to absorb, and you can see some of them have larger, and even there's an orange one down there. Some of them are larger here as well, but because here there wasn't as much liquid on the countertop, so there wasn't as much space for the pigment to spread and then be captured by neighboring yarn, we see less of those little sections. There we go. I figured out how to lay it out in a grid, even though, well, you can't really see the speckles very well from far away. But in each and every one of these cases, the speckles are full of different colors, and it is just so much fun. I definitely have more I want to do to play with this muck powder, and I would even consider creating more of my own custom mixes to try to get other types of multicolored speckles. The 2 yarn mops that I use to wipe my gloves off with any powder on them are also multicolored works of art. This is where I did some of that full immersion speckling and really watched that citric acid powder sink down, and that gave us some incredibly soft and small speckles on this muted variegated base, which is a lot of fun. It's just always fun to think, like, technically this was one color I used. It just happens to be a pre-mixed color, just like a lot of other pre-mixed colors in my collection. This one just probably happens to have a very complicated recipe. And now we have all of the yarn twisted up. Well, there's a lot more I haven't twisted off camera, but hey, I have all 4 of our variations. And as you know, I made too much of this muck color mixed with citric acid, so I have that stored and ready to play with some more. And I still have some of the non-citric acid muck powder as well. I have always enjoyed playing with acid dye colors that break. So creating my own mixture that has this really unique rainbow speckling from just one powder is a lot of fun. Now, granted, it took a long time to make that muck dye, but I am certainly open to trying other custom mixes from dyes in my collection in the future. For example, would you be interested in me mixing all of the Dharma acid dyes I have in my collection? There are a lot more than 40, and the average color isn't necessarily the same because it all comes down to the various amounts of pigments in each of the colors. And Dharma has a lot of pre-mixed pastels that can dilute things, and I haven't done analysis to see what their ratios of reds to pinks to blues are. So I don't currently have a prediction. But anyway, if that is a video that you would like to see, let me know in the comments down below. But also, please make sure you are subscribed to the ChemKnits Tutorials YouTube channel. In addition to special series like this one, I post at least 2 new videos every single week, and you don't want to miss it. And as for Chanukah, every night at 8:30 p.m. Eastern Time, there will be a new premiere of a yarn dyeing video. So you can watch, hang out in the live chat, and some evenings I will even be in the chat room to react to the video along with you, and it is so much fun. And don't forget, the series will extend a few nights beyond Chanukah because there are some bonus videos. And so it's just so much fun, and you don't want to miss any of it. But yeah, I am just so excited with, and I don't know if you can see it from this far away, but we have so many different colors on here from what was technically one color. Technically. Yes, I mixed 40 colors together, but if you consider that there are a lot of pre-mixed colors that have various pigments in it to get to a particular hue, this is just a pre-mixed color. Just one I created. Chanukah is really early this year. Tonight is the Sunday after Thanksgiving, which means it's Cyber Weekend, and there are still so many Black Friday, tomorrow's Cyber Monday. There's so many sales and specials going on right now, and this includes the ChemKnits Creations Etsy shop. Now, my shop is filled with hand-dyed yarn that has been featured in my videos, and for this Cyber Weekend, I have a lot of individual ready-to-ship skeins that are marked down, and I have some other special listings and deals that are only available through tomorrow, Monday, November 30th at midnight Eastern Time. So if you'd like to take advantage of any of these special clearance deals, go and check out my shop. You'll find links down in the video description. But anyway, I am Rebecca from ChemKnits, and I really hope you're excited to see what is going to be coming for Hanukkah Night 2 tomorrow night. So I will see you here on the ChemKnits Tutorials YouTube channel at 8:30 p.m. Eastern Time for a new video. Thank you so much for watching, and happy Hanukkah!